Hello friends, I'm glad you're back for another video in our theme of the month, commonly asked questions, and here's one that I get all the time. This is one of the trickiest parts of writing a book in general, but a memoir specifically because of two things. Let me tell you what the thing is first, okay? So we're talking about structure. What is the best structure for my book? That's a question I get a lot in various forms. And a structure for a memoir is tricky because number one, you're bound by the truth, okay? You can't make this stuff up as you go. You can only really write about what happened. So there's no like adjusting things to make it fit better. Unfortunately, that's kind of one of the tricky little mountains we have to climb as memoirists. And number two, typically when you're telling a story, it feels natural to start at the beginning and go to the end and saying, this is what happened first, and then this is what happened after that, and then this is what happened after that. Now, we all know that type of structure, that linear straight line structure, doesn't work usually the best for engagement purposes. Keeping your readers turning the pages, wondering what's happened, keeping the tension in the story and the suspense and pacing and flow and all of that. We know that there are books and movies out there that have done this thing differently in a different way and are not linear, and they work really well. That being said, linear is not bad or wrong. It just doesn't work as well as some other structures for most stories. It may very well work for yours. And I typically, when my clients come at me with this structure problem, this structure question, I say, let's just start at the beginning and go to the end, and we'll kind of figure it out as we go, right? You can always move pieces around once they're out. You just can't move them around if they don't exist. So, so let's talk about structure. There are many structures you can consider. Not all structures are one size fits all, okay? They're depending on you, your story, your book, your skill set, the amount of effort and energy you want to put into this. It all determines what the best structure is for your book. So here's a few things to consider when thinking about structure. Number one, the order of the events. We just mentioned that. Obviously there's strict chronological beginning to end. You can start there and then mold as you go if you need to, but this is, for lack of a better way to describe it, like the boring way. It's not that interesting. It's not that interesting to say, like, let me tell you a story. I'm going to start at the beginning. It's more interesting to go, hey, did I ever tell you about the story I flew my car off the cliff? We're going, oh my gosh, yes, please tell us that story. You didn't tell us the story about the time you went on a Sunday drive and something happened, so see, there's just a little flip where you start in the middle, or you start at the climax, or you start at the building of the suspense and take us back in time. So we'll talk about more structures as we go, but strict chronological is not a bad way to start. You can mold from there. Another way some memoirists do it is where they kind of jump backwards and forwards in time, okay? So they're kind of playing with the timeline here. This can be very challenging, and it can be confusing if you don't do it right. But sometimes it works really well because you're kind of moving us along, but it's this really shifty structure where you're going, let me take you back a little bit. Now let me jump you ahead to what happened. And you're moving us to a point. We just don't know where we're going. It's unpredictable. It adds an element of surprise. It's kind of gives us that tension, but it is challenging for the writer and the reader. So make sure that you take that into account before you really try to structure your book. How well will this work? And understand, when you think of structure, especially with something that's very complex like this one, how will the readers take it? How will they process it? Will it engage them or will it frustrate them? There's a fine line. Okay, so like I just mentioned, another way you can do this is you can open with the turning point, kind of like the thing that happened that made your story shift gears into a different direction. This is usually a very dramatic event. It's something that catches our eyes, that catches our attention, and then you drop back in time and you take us kind of back to the beginning and let us know how things led to that point, and then you continue on from that point, okay? So we're going to talk about that particular story shape in a minute. Another way you can mess with timeline, the sequence of events, is having two timelines. There's almost two timelines that go forward simultaneously, and usually it alternates chapters. This can work really well. In fact, I just read a book by one of our group members. Ask me in the comments, I'll tell you, where she tells us a story about what's happening current day. And then in the next chapter, she's taking us back a certain amount of years, and she's telling us another story that's very related. And they both move ahead at their own pace, but they're both moving ahead. And it's like they intersect at a certain point and everything comes together and we see how it's very connected. She did it really well. This also can be quite tricky to do, but it can work really well. Instead of going, like, I have this story to tell you, but let me tell you about what happened in the past as well. And then like you keep going back there within the same chapter. If you feel like that's something you're going to be wanting to do, is to go to the past and a specific point in the past. Often think about doing it in chapter sections, bigger chunks, right? Instead of doing like paragraphs or sections within the chapter. It's a neater container to do this kind of two timeline thing. And you don't have to feel like you are just dumping a bunch of backstory in frequently. You're not losing the pace. We understand, like, okay, end of chapter, now we're going to go back here to a different storyline, different timeline, and learn about what happened back here. And okay, next chapter, we're going back to this place. We kind of get it. Readers understand that format and that structure. So this one can be really fun to play with. It might work well for yours. Another way to mess with time is reverse chronological. This can be really tricky, but you start out with the end. Let me tell you how I got here. And you kind of work your way back to like how it all started. It can be tricky to pull off because it's like we're going backwards and we don't see how things develop all the time backwards, but sometimes it can work really well. Maybe this is something you do in sections. I don't know if that might work better for some stories, but this is something that some books have explored and done really well. So think about that. This could be a fun challenge. So the second thing I want you to think about when you think about structure is shape. And I want you to think of the word owe, like I owe you money. You owe me an explanation, OWE. Because there are 3 letter shapes I want to talk with you about, OWE. The first O is essentially just a circular structure. It's something that a standard kind of chronologically based memoir is typically not going to work well with, but it might be great for like a series of essays. If you're doing, if you feel like your memoir is more short story pieces, that might work better. It's tough on a single plot line, but what happens is you kind of tell us that there's this thing you're going for, okay? There's this key challenge or question, and you're like, I need to figure this out. And then you kind of take action and you loop around, and well, that didn't work. I'm still like working on trying to figure this out, and you take action and you loop back around. That didn't work. I'm taking action. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like you come back to the beginning. The beginning is where you identify a challenge. You identify this problem or this question you're facing. Why am I like this? Or why does this keep happening to me or whatever? And then you journey on in your story, and you have to kind of reassess and learn and gather information. And you take us back to help us understand, like, did you solve your question? Did you find the answer to the challenge that you were facing here? So it has this analysis almost process. You're not like getting in your head and analyzing, but you're showing us in your journey how you really like went around and you were like, okay, I'm seeking something here. Let me see if I can find it. So it's almost like showing us your attempts at discovering something. That's what we mean by circular, because you're always taking us back to the beginning point somehow. Instead of think of a linear story where you're going like, I started here and I ended way over here. This story starts and ends kind of in the same place. I started with this question. I'm going to try to find the answer, and I'm going to circle back to the question, because that's really what this is all about, is discovering the answer to this question. Eat, Pray, Love is a circular memoir. She raises the stakes in each round. So, she eats to recover from a bad relationship. She then prays to kind of discover herself and her spirituality, and then love, she kind of moves towards her healing. So she has these kind of circles within this book. That's a good example of it. It might be hard to flesh out in the story, but think of it that way if you approach that book, or if you've already read that book. Take it back and think of how you can see those circles. So I would suggest that this works better for a shorter piece, maybe, a series of short stories. It's going to be difficult for a more linear, longer piece. It needs to have a sense of like, your readers are almost going to be like, great, here she goes again, trying to figure this thing out. But not in a repetitive way. Not like, oh man, I wish this wasn't happening yet again. It's like you're giving it another stab, but you're doing it with gained knowledge, and you're really like going a different direction, going about it differently almost. And they're like with you, feeling like, okay, I really hope she gets it this time. I really hope this works this time. I really hope she finds what she's looking for. So that's that story. The story shape O. Next is W, and I call this the shape W, but it's something that others have referred to as storyboarding. You might have heard this, but it's essentially your book poses a central question or issue in the beginning, and the answer resolves it, but you go on this journey to find it, okay? If you think about a W, we're up here, and we go down, and we go back up and down and up, okay? So it gives us this sense of motion. There's rising and falling action. There's that tension from the up and down points. Those 5 key points are like triggering events that get that action moving. So the first event is really what sparks the motion, the movement in your story. The second point is a conflict or a complication that kind of needs to get worked through. Like you have to deal with it, and it creates some tension and some movement, some rising action. The third point on the W is really where your action is like sent spiraling down, right? Like this is where something is going to hit you kind of hard. That fourth, that lowest point is really where you kind of have your rock bottom moment. It's the lowest point of the story. So you're really taking us down before you hit that 5th point, which is, that kind of rising action to the conclusion. So again, it's that W shape. I mean, yours might not be a perfect W. Maybe you don't go down as far or up as far, but you hit the bottom really, really hard, or maybe you have a longer journey up to the conclusion. But think of it with those kind of main points. You have some triggering action. You have a conflict you have to work through. You have kind of a spiral down and hit hard at that 4th point, and then you move towards your action or your conclusion. So what you end up with on the W is like the skeleton. It's the bare bones of your memoir. And then you go and you fill in the little points in between, all of the little scenes that need to happen in between those 5 big points. These are not the 5 scenes in your story, right? These are not the 5 things that happen. These are just kind of the 5 turning points. So you can have fun visually with this. You can write it out, draw it out if you're artistically inclined. I'm a Post-it note type of girl, so I find a wall or a big white space or a big whiteboard or something and use my Post-it notes to kind of play with this. So you can definitely use this as a tool to start visualizing what is the best structure. Move things around if it feels like maybe some tension could be built. Like, for example, if you have a short little trip down, well, what else happened? Maybe lengthen it. Give us a harder drop, or give us more of a rising action. So it's not just like oh yeah, and then I just got back up and happy ending, right? So you can kind of lengthen things or play with them, make them stretch out longer, give us some more suspense, some more tension in different areas. And that visual, W kind of shape and being able to play with this physically with something like Post-it notes or something else will really help you see where you can bring more to your story and stretch it out or fill it in or, reshape it a little bit. So the last letter is E, a lowercase e. And I alluded to this one earlier, but this kind of flows like you would see a lowercase e. You start at that cross point where the little, the loop, where the line touches itself, right? Because it's kind of one loop. So it's at that cross point where this is kind of the moment of like a key decision in your story, okay? It's sort of like a pivotal moment. You're taking us to this big thing. And then you move forward a little bit and you kind of tell us like what happened. And then really what you're doing is you're looping back on itself. You're going, okay, how did I end up here? Right? You're kind of like, this is how I think of it. I'm telling you something big that happened. I'm giving you some more detail. I'm taking you along for the ride for a little bit. And then I sort of pump the brakes and I go, let's elevate this for a minute. And I kind of step back and I look at it from a bit of a ways away. And I go, how did I end up here? That's the question you have to answer as you loop back around. You're giving us some backstory. You're helping us fill in the blank of how did I end up here? And you're kind of returning us to that point of action at the, when you loop back around. And then you really, fill that bottom of the E in, right? You have to give us the events and the context that got you to this point of action, and then you take us full steam ahead, right? You don't have to give us that action scene again, right? Maybe you skip to the end of the action scene where you left off. Or you kind of tell us what happened after that, right? You don't have to go over that again. You're not retracing that part of the story, but you're moving ahead on a different level, saying, okay, yep, we covered that. Now let me tell you what really, like, where this led. If you look at stories, is a more common structure to kind of take us to a point of action, loop back around to the beginning and say, like, let me tell you how I got here. Let me fill you in on a bit of backstory. And then they go forward and say, okay, let me keep going here. I did a developmental edit on one book where she took me to the point that happened really late in her story. So it was like a really big, it was like a big backstory E, right? She took me to the point that happened really late. She gave me a little bit, but then she took me like way back here. Now that can work, but sometimes what happens is if you go back too far, your readers will forget like where they started the book. Oh yeah, that's right. I remember she was, in this case, like giving birth to her son that she thought she would never have. It was a great moment, and I think her structure worked well, but the danger again is that your readers may forget about that beginning scene. That one worked well because it's very memorable. Like, we remember she wanted this son so bad, but her story was a struggle about, some other things, and at one point she didn't think she could have kids, and et cetera, et cetera. So we kind of remembered in the back of our head, oh, but she did have one. So let's see how she got there. Like, we were kind of like, yep, we got it. We're remembering that. Now take us through this whole story. But be careful with that E, because if you take us too far back, we're going to forget what the conflict was in the beginning. Or if you don't bring us enough ahead, right? Like, you're just going to be like, by the way, there was this time I did this thing. Let me tell you how that happened. And even if you don't take us far enough back, we may not be as engaged in that event. So you kind of have to play with this. How much is too much? How much is not enough? How far back is enough? How far forward do you take us on the E? Those types of things. There might be a moment in your story that's really pivotal that you're like, I don't know if I want to give this to him so early. Maybe that's not where you start. Maybe that's kind of the, action after you loop back around. You kind of keep us going. It's that downward slope on the E. Think of a roller coaster. That's where you kind of like get some speed, right? So maybe that's where your story picks back up and all of a sudden we're back in the action and we're zooming full speed ahead, okay? So that can be a really fun shape to play with. That's typically where most memoirists like to go if they're not going to do a straight line. Like I said, the O structure shape is more difficult. It doesn't fit as many stories as well. The W can work for you. You just sort of have to have the right pattern to the events in order for it to fit. It's typically pretty moldable to most stories. And the E is something that works quite well. So there's only a couple more things. I know this is a longer video, but there's a couple more things that I want you to think about when considering structure for your book. Think about sections. If your book feels like it can be divided into like 2 or more parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, you'll see there's a natural answer to that. Sectioning can be a way to support your reader, like getting through your material, and it can also be really hard, or really, I guess I can say that way. It can be really hard to revise an entire book in one piece versus revising 2 shorter sections or 3 shorter sections, because they're little containers. Obviously they're going to be related, but you know that the stuff in section 1 isn't going to be moved to section 2. And section 2, it wouldn't be moved to section 3, right? So they're smaller containers. So think about sections for your book. That might or might not work well. And then make sure your theme is really strong throughout the entire book. You want to string your scenes along with those thematic threads, right? I think of it just like you're sewing, just like a little sewing needle, and there's this thread, and sometimes you can see it and sometimes you can't, but it's there. You know it's there. There may be elements that some of your scenes have in common, like relationship conflicts or illnesses, or whatever your theme is. These scenes don't have to occur in chronological order, but they can jump around, but because you're weaving your theme in with transitions, connecting words, you're like constantly giving us those little glimpses of like the theme being there, then that can help us feel like this is one cohesive piece, and that gives a little more flavor to something like a linear story. So think about, I'm working on a book right now with a gentleman who's writing a story on his like lust for adventure, and he becomes a pilot and he travels the world. And at first it was just sort of like, here's some cool stories about me traveling the world. And yes, they were cool, but what was missing was his theme. We didn't see this whole adventure thing. What was he giving up by chasing this adventure? What was he gaining by chasing this adventure? And so we're working on weaving that little thread of theme throughout his book. That's not necessarily a structure, but it's what helps your structure stick together. His is very linear. We're not starting in the middle and looping back. That doesn't work for his book. So this gives it a very cohesive feel to it, and not a first this, then that, then this, right? The boring kind of flavorless line of a story. It really helps amplify it. So last thing I'm going to share with you on this video is just a quick exercise to try to identify some themes that you might consider for your book. Grab a couple of your favorite memoirs and see what you can flesh out. Try to draw a timeline of the events in those books. Maybe, with some dates, or, if they give you ages or something, see if the author moves with that straight line, or if they loop back in an E, or if they're going, maybe they're doing the 2 timelines. See what you can flesh out. Does it move back and forth in time? Identify the theme or themes for each chapter. Remember, a theme is something you can kind of sum up in 1 or 2 words, sort of like love, finding my soulmate, seeking adventure. My theme is surviving domestic abuse, right? Those couple words, a phrase. What are the theme or themes in each chapter? Remember, a book can have sub-themes. So you may be picking up more on a sub-theme in some chapters versus the main theme, but see what you can see. See what you can see. Look to see what you can find as far as the themes and sub-themes, and then see how they're organized. Are they organized in clusters? Are they organized by just like one big thread going through, and maybe each chapter has a different sub-theme? Look at the themes, look at the book thematically and see what you can flesh out. And then look at those transitions between the chapters and between the events. This is one thing that I probably talk about till I'm blue in the face in my developmental reviews. You're missing some transitions here. We need to understand how these chapters are connected, how these events are connected, what is the unifying piece between them. What mechanisms do the authors in your favorite memoirs use to connect these themes or events together? And when I say mechanisms, look for words, look for phrases. Do they use headings? Do they use something else that visually cues you into a transition? So that's an exercise to try. Grab a couple of your favorite books. Maybe there's one you're thinking like, I think my book sounds like that one. Get that one off the shelf and do this exercise. See what you can find. And that'll help you decide what might work best for your book. Okay, so this was a long video. Thank you for hanging in with me. We're going to continue talking about some other structures in the next couple of videos because this is a big concept for book writing in general. So stay tuned. I will have more for you coming up, and I'll see you there.